Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. We place an almost sacred trust in the things that heal us, in the white coat of a doctor, the sterile seal of a pill bottle, the ancient promise of medicine to deliver us from suffering. Pain is a universal human experience, a primal signal of distress, and for centuries, our greatest minds have sought to conquer it. We have built an entire industry, a cathedral of science and commerce, on the simple premise of relief. But what happens when that trust is broken? What happens when the cathedral is occupied by mercenaries? When the promise of relief is not a mission, but a marketing strategy? What happens when the thing designed to heal becomes a vector for a plague? We are, all of us, living in the ruins of that broken trust. You know it as the opioid epidemic, a slow-motion disaster that has claimed, directly and indirectly, over 1 million American lives, a crisis that has hollowed out entire communities, shattered families, and rewritten the baseline of American life expectancy. It is a story of addiction, despair, and death. But it is also a story of a crime so vast it is almost invisible, committed not in a dark alley with a gun, but in sunlit boardrooms with spreadsheets and focus groups. The perpetrators were not masked thugs. They were philanthropists, art patrons, their names etched in gold on the walls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Louvre, Harvard, and Yale. They are the Sackler family, and this is the story of how they built an empire on a mountain of pain, and then, when the bill came due, attempted to use the very laws of the land as a shield for their generational fortune. Today on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a boardroom massacre. We will examine how one family, and the company they controlled, built an empire on a foundation of calculated misrepresentation, turning a public health tool into a public health catastrophe. We will explore the specific marketing techniques that turned doctors into dealers, the internal knowledge that warned them of the dangers, and the labyrinthine legal strategy they deployed to protect their billions. This is the anatomy of a pharmaceutical crime. This story, like the family itself, begins with 3 brothers from Brooklyn, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler. All 3 became psychiatrists, but it was the eldest, Arthur, who possessed the true family gift. It was not medicine, it was marketing. Arthur Sackler was a visionary. In the 1950s, drug companies largely sold to pharmacists. Arthur had a revolutionary idea: market directly and aggressively to doctors. He ran a medical advertising agency, McAdams, and he understood something profound about the medical profession. Doctors were human. They were susceptible to influence, to data, to authority, and to flattery. Arthur perfected the playbook. He would pioneer the marketing for drugs like Librium and, most famously, Valium. He funded sympathetic experts and independent research. He placed multi-page, full-color ads in prestigious medical journals, ads that looked less like advertisements and more like scientific articles. He trained legions of sales representatives to build personal relationships with physicians, to downplay side effects, and to hammer home a single simple message. With Valium, the message was that it wasn't just for severe anxiety, it was for the routine stresses of everyday life. He made Valium the first $100 million drug in history. Arthur M. Sackler taught the pharmaceutical industry how to sell. While Arthur ran his ad agency, he and his younger brothers, Mortimer and Raymond, purchased a small, struggling drug company in 1952. They called it Purdue Frederick. For decades, it was a modest success, selling products like the antiseptic betadine and a laxative. Arthur's marketing genius benefited the entire family, but he was always clear. His advertising business and Purdue were separate. When Arthur died in 1987, his brothers bought his shares in Purdue from his estate. Mortimer and Raymond, along with their children, now had full control of the company, and by the early 1990s, they had a problem. The patent on their most profitable drug, a time-released morphine pill called OxyContin, was about to expire. They were facing a patent cliff, a sudden, catastrophic loss of revenue as generic versions flooded the market. They needed a new blockbuster. They needed their Valium. The answer was found in a drawer: oxycodone. It was not a new drug. It had been synthesized in Germany in 1916. It was a well-known potent opioid, twice as powerful as morphine. It was already on the market in combination pills like Percocet, but it was feared. Doctors knew oxycodone was highly addictive and tended to use it only for acute, short-term pain, like after surgery. Purdue's innovation, or so they claimed, was to apply their Contin system to this old drug. They would create a pill of pure oxycodone in massive doses with a patented time-release coating. This coating would, in theory, release the drug slowly and evenly over a 12-hour period. This, Purdue argued, was the magic key. This new drug was named OxyContin, and the marketing claim that would launch it was as simple as it was devastatingly false. Because of the 12-hour time-release mechanism, the risk of addiction was negligible. Purdue needed the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, to validate this claim, and they got it. In 1995, the FDA approved OxyContin for the treatment of moderate to severe chronic pain. The examiner who oversaw the approval, Dr. Curtis Wright, left the FDA shortly thereafter. Within 2 years, he had a new job at Purdue Pharma, with a first-year compensation package of nearly $400,000. But the real prize was the label. Purdue successfully lobbied the FDA to include a remarkable, unprecedented sentence. The label for OxyContin stated, "Delayed absorption, as provided by OxyContin tablets, is believed to reduce the abuse liability of the drug." This sentence was marketing gold. It was a government-sanctioned seal of approval, a permission slip for doctors to prescribe an incredibly powerful opioid with a clear conscience. Where did this belief come from? It was built on a house of cards. Purdue's key citation was a 5-sentence letter to the editor published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980. This letter, by researchers Herschel Jick and Jane Porter, simply noted that in their specific dataset of patients who were hospitalized and given small doses of opioids under strict supervision, addiction was rare. It was not a study. It was not peer-reviewed. It was an anecdote. Yet Purdue, in its marketing materials, would cite this Porter and Jick letter as a landmark study, trumpeting the finding that less than 1% of patients treated with opioids became addicted. It was the less than 1% lie, and it became the gospel of the new pain revolution. With the FDA's blessing and a marketing strategy inherited from Arthur Sackler, Purdue Pharma prepared to launch its blizzard. The man at the helm of this operation was Richard Sackler, Raymond's son. Richard was driven, intense, and, as his own emails would later reveal, obsessed with sales. He had been with Purdue for years, and OxyContin was his project, his legacy. In 1996, the company launched OxyContin with the largest pharmaceutical marketing campaign in history. They doubled their sales force, creating an army of over 600 reps. This army was armed with a simple, seductive message: pain is undertreated in America. You, the doctor, have a moral imperative to relieve suffering, And now, finally, you have a tool to do it safely. Purdue reps were incentivized with a bonus system that had no cap. Bonuses were tied directly to the volume and, crucially, the dosage of OxyContin they sold. A representative who convinced a doctor to switch from low-dose 10 mg pills to high-dose 80 mg or even 160 mg pills would see their bonuses skyrocket. Some reps were earning hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in bonuses alone. They targeted doctors with military precision. Purdue used data mining firms to identify the highest prescribers of opioids in every zip code. These high-decile doctors, family physicians, general practitioners, internists in rural areas, were targeted relentlessly. They were taken to dinner. They were given fishing trips, golf outings, and box seats at sporting events. Purdue also funded an entire ecosystem of influence. They poured millions into non-profit groups like the American Pain Society and the American Academy of Pain Medicine. These organizations began to aggressively push a new concept, pain as the fifth vital sign. Hospital accreditation boards were lobbied to require that all patients be asked to rate their pain on a scale of 1 to 10. The implication was clear. If a patient reported pain, the doctor was failing. The most insidious marketing tactic, however, was a medical-sounding concept called pseudo-addiction. Purdue's reps were trained to teach this to doctors. If a patient exhibited all the classic signs of addiction, clock watching, demanding early refills, doctor shopping, claiming their pills were lost or stolen, the representative would explain that this was not true addiction. It was pseudo-addiction. It was a sign that the patient's pain was being undertreated. The solution, they were told, was not to taper the patient off the drug. The solution was to prescribe a higher dose of OxyContin. This strategy was designed to do one thing: expand the market. Opioids had traditionally been reserved for end-stage cancer pain or acute post-surgical pain. This was a small market. The real money, the blockbuster money, was in non-cancer pain: chronic back pain, arthritis, fibromyalgia, headaches. Purdue, using the less than 1% lie and the pseudo-addiction myth, successfully convinced a generation of doctors to use a drug as powerful as heroin for everyday chronic ailments. The results were immediate and staggering. In 1996, its first full year, OxyContin sales were $48 million. By 2000, just 4 years later, sales surpassed $1.1 billion. By 2001, OxyContin was the most prescribed brand-name narcotic in America. At a launch party in 1996, Richard Sackler himself told the assembled sales force what he expected. He predicted a blizzard of prescriptions that will bury the competition. He was right, but the blizzard buried far more than that. The first warnings came not from regulators, but from rural America. In Appalachia, in the mining towns of West Virginia, the hollows of eastern Kentucky, the struggling communities of southwestern Virginia, a new epidemic was emerging. They called it hillbilly heroin. Local police began noticing a spike in pharmacy break-ins. Doctors reported patients becoming increasingly desperate, and overdose deaths began to climb, slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. The central premise of the drug, the 12-hour time release, was a failure in two critical ways. First, it was easily defeated. Users quickly discovered that by crushing the pill and snorting or injecting the powder, they could bypass the Contin coating entirely. This delivered the entire massive dose of pure oxycodone at once, producing a euphoric rush identical to heroin. But the second failure was more systematic and far more sinister. It was the one that addicted countless patients who were taking the pill exactly as prescribed. For many patients, the drug did not last 12 hours. It often wore off in 8 or even 6. This meant that for hours before their next safe dose, patients were plunged into the agonizing flu-like sickness of acute opioid withdrawal. They would experience drenching sweats, nausea, body-racking aches, and profound anxiety. They weren't addicts. They were patients, following their doctor's orders. But their bodies, trapped in this cycle of peak and trough euphoria and withdrawal, were being physically rewired for dependence. When they told their doctors the pill wasn't lasting, the doctors, trained by Purdue's reps, had a simple answer: pseudo-addiction. They increased the dose. This end-of-dose failure was the engine of the epidemic. It was the mechanism that created a mass market of addicted individuals. And the most damning fact, which would only emerge years later in court, was that Purdue Pharma knew. Internal documents, clinical trial data, and memos from before the drug was ever launched showed that Purdue was aware of the 12-hour failure. They knew patients in their own studies were complaining that the relief didn't last. They knew. They also knew, almost immediately, about the abuse. In 1997, a sales representative in West Virginia reported abuse of OxyContin by a local physician. In 1998, a Purdue-funded study in Puerto Rico had to be shut down because nearly all the study subjects were actively abusing the drug. Purdue's response was not to fix the drug or correct the marketing. Their response was to blame the victim. This strategy was championed by Richard Sackler himself. In 2001, in response to an email about the growing concerns over addiction and death, he wrote a now infamous reply: "This is not too bad. It could have been worse. We have to hammer on the abusers in every way possible. They are the culprits and the problem. They are reckless criminals." The company's official position was that it was not responsible for the actions of criminal abusers who misused their product. But the abusers and the patients were increasingly the same people, trapped in a cycle the company itself had engineered and promoted. By the early 2000s, the blizzard was a full-blown hurricane. The U.S. Attorney for Maine, Jay McCloskey, issued a public warning in 2000, calling OxyContin a grave public health threat. Media reports from outlets like the New York Times began connecting the dots between Purdue's marketing and the devastation in rural communities. The FDA, finally recognizing its catastrophic error, demanded Purdue remove the "believed to reduce the abuse liability" phrase from its label in 2001. But the damage was done. The seeds of the epidemic had been sown, and now the legal system was beginning to stir. The first major reckoning came from the Western District of Virginia. A young, tenacious federal prosecutor named John Brownlee began a multi-year grand jury investigation into Purdue Pharma. His team meticulously built a case, interviewing doctors, sales reps, and victims. They subpoenaed the internal documents, the marketing plans, and the memos. They found the smoking guns, the proof that Purdue knew about the 12-hour failure, the evidence that they had trained their reps to lie about the less than 1% figure, and the documentation of the pseudo-addiction marketing script. In 2007, the case was ready. Brownlee's team was preparing felony indictments against the company and against 3 of its top executives: the CEO, Michael Friedman, the top lawyer, Howard Udall, and the former chief medical officer, Paul Goldenheim. The charges included conspiracy, wire fraud, and felony misbranding of a drug with intent to defraud and mislead. This was a mortal threat to Purdue. A felony conviction for the company could trigger debarment, meaning it would be banned from doing any business with the federal government, specifically Medicare and Medicaid. This would be a corporate death sentence. A flurry of high-level negotiations began. Purdue hired Rudy Giuliani, then a presidential hopeful and former star prosecutor, to lobby the Justice Department on their behalf. The goal was to avoid the felony charges for the executives, which could mean prison time, and to save the company from debarment. In May 2007, a deal was struck. It was a classic compromise that left no one satisfied. Purdue Pharma LP, the company, would plead guilty to a felony charge of misbranding with the intent to defraud or mislead. It was a stunning admission. The company was now a convicted felon. The three executives, however, would be spared. In a separate deal, they pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor misbranding charge, a strict liability offense that carried no jail time. They were, in essence, admitting that the crime happened on their watch, but not that they were personally responsible for it. The company and the executives collectively paid $634.5 million in fines. At the time, it was one of the largest settlements in pharmaceutical history. In a press conference, John Brownlee declared victory, stating that Purdue had admitted that it illegally marketed and promoted OxyContin. The Sackler family released a statement expressing their deep regret about the plea, but pointedly admitting no personal wrongdoing. They were not charged. Their names were not on the plea agreement. For Purdue and the Sacklers, this $634.5 million fine was not justice. It was a cost of doing business. In that same year, 2007, Purdue Pharma generated over $1.7 billion in revenue, most of it from OxyContin. They had bought their way out of the crisis. They had admitted to the core of the crime, lying about the drug's addictive properties, and yet the family and the fortune remained untouched. The 2007 plea did little to stop the epidemic. In fact, it was about to morph into something even deadlier. In 2010, facing overwhelming public and legal pressure, Purdue finally reformulated OxyContin. They created a new version, OxyContin Op, which was coated in a polymer that made it difficult to crush or dissolve. It was a tacit admission that the original design was a failure. But for the millions of people who were already physically dependent on oxycodone, this just meant their supply was cut off. It was like putting a lock on a barn after the horses have bolted. These millions of individuals did not simply get better. They were sick, they were in withdrawal, and they sought relief. They found it on the black market. As prescription opioids became harder to get, a cheaper, more potent, and more available alternative filled the vacuum: heroin, and soon after, illicitly manufactured fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin. Purdue Pharma, through OxyContin, had not just created a generation of addicts. It had created the customer base for the entire modern illicit opioid market. The line from the doctor's office to the street corner, from the pill bottle to the needle, was direct, and the death toll exploded. The 2007 plea had been a federal criminal case. The next wave of litigation was a civil onslaught. This time, the plaintiffs weren't just a few prosecutors. It was an avalanche. States, cities, counties, and tribal nations, one by one, began to sue Purdue Pharma. But this time they also sued the Sackler family members personally. They named Richard Sackler. They named his father Raymond and his uncle Mortimer. They named their children, the third generation of Sacklers who sat on the board. The allegation was different. It wasn't just misbranding. It was public nuisance. The plaintiffs argued that the Sacklers and their company had knowingly created a public health catastrophe, a crisis that forced states and cities to spend billions of dollars on police, ambulances, emergency rooms, addiction treatment centers, and foster care for the children of addicted parents. These thousands of lawsuits were eventually consolidated into a single massive case, a multi-district litigation, or MDL, overseen by a federal judge in Cleveland, Ohio. The discovery process for this case unearthed the most damning evidence yet. The reckless criminal's email from Richard Sackler, the marketing plans that targeted high-decile prescribers, the internal memos proving knowledge of the 12-hour failure. It was now clear, in a way it had not been in 2007, that the Sackler family members were not just passive owners. They were active architects. They had been on the board meetings. They had approved the marketing plans. They had read the reports. They had pushed the sales force to sell more, and at higher doses, long after the epidemic was a known public fact. The Sacklers were now facing a legal threat that could not be solved with a simple fine. They were facing personal, civil liability that could, in theory, eclipse their entire fortune. They saw the writing on the wall, and they prepared their escape. As the lawsuits against them piled up, the Sacklers began to move their money. Between 2008 and 2017, as legal scrutiny intensified, the family systematically approved payouts from Purdue Pharma to themselves totaling over $10.4 billion. This money was transferred out of the company and into a complex web of offshore trusts and personal bank accounts, far beyond the easy reach of American courts. They were, in effect, draining the company of the very assets that would be needed to pay for the damage it had caused. Then, with the company's coffers emptied and the MDL trial date looming in 2019, the Sacklers deployed their final, most cynical legal weapon. In September 2019, Purdue Pharma LP, the company that had made them one of the richest families in the world, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This was not a normal bankruptcy. Purdue was not a failed business. It was, even then, a profitable company. This was a legal strategy. A Chapter 11 filing triggers a legal provision called an automatic stay, which instantly freezes all litigation against the company. The 2,000-plus lawsuits in the Cleveland MDL were stopped dead in their tracks. But here was the catch. The Sacklers themselves, the individuals, were not bankrupt. Their $10 billion-plus fortune was intact. The bankruptcy filing, however, moved the entire dispute into a single bankruptcy court in White Plains, New York, overseen by a single judge, Robert Drain. The Sacklers then presented their grand bargain. They, the non-bankrupt family members, would contribute a portion of their fortune to a settlement fund. They initially offered $3 billion, which was met with outrage. They slowly increased the offer, eventually landing at a total contribution of $6 billion, to be paid out over nearly 2 decades. This money would be used to fund addiction abatement programs and pay small, symbolic amounts to individual victims. In exchange for this $6 billion, the Sacklers demanded one thing: a non-consensual third-party release. This is the legal and moral core of the entire case. This release would be a permanent, global shield. It would grant every member of the Sackler family and their associates immunity from all current and future civil lawsuits related to the opioid crisis. It was an audacious move. They were asking a bankruptcy judge to use the power of the court to extinguish the legal claims of every man, woman, state, and city in America, even those who did not agree to the settlement. The Sacklers were attempting to use a corporate bankruptcy as a personal laundromat for their liability. They had taken $10.4 billion out of the company and were now offering $6 billion back in exchange for permanent, total absolution. Most of the states, desperate for any money to combat the epidemic, reluctantly agreed to the deal. It was a bitter pill. They felt it was the only way to get funds to the front lines quickly. But a small principled group held out. 9 states, including Connecticut, Washington, and Massachusetts, along with the U.S. trustee, a watchdog for the Department of Justice, fought the plan. They argued it was an unconstitutional abuse of the bankruptcy system. You cannot, they argued, buy immunity. You cannot use a corporate filing to strip victims of their day in court against the individuals who allegedly wronged them. In 2021, Judge Robert Drain approved the settlement. He agreed with the Sacklers' argument. This pragmatic deal was the only path forward. The Sacklers had their shield. Justice, it seemed, had been sidelined for expediency. The holdout states and the U.S. trustee appealed. In late 2021, a U.S. district judge agreed with them, striking down the settlement and calling the non-consensual releases repugnant. The Sacklers appealed that decision. In May 2023, the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals sided with the Sacklers, reinstating the settlement and their immunity. The case, now a fundamental question about the very nature of our legal system, landed at the last stop. The Supreme Court of the United States. In August 2023, the High Court agreed to hear the case, putting the entire $6 billion settlement and the Sacklers' shield on ice. The central question was simple. Does the U.S. Bankruptcy Code allow a court to extinguish legal claims against a non-bankrupt party without the consent of the people holding those claims? In June 2024, the Supreme Court delivered its answer. In a 5-4 decision, the court ruled against the Sacklers. Justice Neil Gorsuch, writing for the majority, found that the Bankruptcy Code does not authorize these sweeping, non-consensual releases. The shield was struck down. The Sacklers were, once again, exposed to personal liability for their role in the opioid epidemic. The ruling was a stunning legal victory for the holdout states and a moral victory for victims. But it was also a practical disaster. The $6 billion settlement was dead. The money for addiction abatement was gone. This forced everyone back to the negotiating table. The Sacklers, now facing the prospect of dying in deposition rooms as they fought thousands of individual lawsuits, still needed a deal. The states, facing a public health emergency, still needed the money. A new settlement was hammered out. It was, in many ways, the same. The Sacklers would pay their $6 billion. Purdue Pharma would be dissolved, and its assets would be turned into a new public benefit corporation, Noah Pharma, which would produce overdose reversal drugs, with all profits going to the abatement funds. But the new deal had one critical difference, forced by the Supreme Court. The releases were consensual. States, local governments, and individual victims could choose to accept their share of the settlement money, and in return, they would release the Sacklers from their lawsuits, or they could opt out of the money and preserve their right to sue the family personally. It was a prisoner's dilemma for victims, but it was, for the first time, a choice. The unconstitutional blanket shield was gone. In the end, nearly every state and plaintiff group agreed to the deal. The practical need for money, even a fraction of what was owed, outweighed the desire for a protracted personal legal battle that might last decades. The Sacklers, for their part, were forced to listen to victim impact statements via Zoom. They issued carefully worded statements of deep regret for the consequences of OxyContin, But to this day, they have never admitted personal wrongdoing. They were not, and will not be, criminally charged. Their $6 billion contribution represents just over half the money they extracted from Purdue in its final years. They remain, by any definition, billionaires. We have dissected the anatomy of a pharmaceutical crime, and what we have found is a chilling blueprint for 21st century malfeasance. The weapon was not a new invention, but an old drug wrapped in a new, fraudulent promise of safety. The motive was not passion or ideology, but the cold, generational pursuit of market share and profit. The method was a marketing blizzard that co-opted the very language of science and compassion, turning healers into vectors and pseudo-addiction into a tool to upsell a dangerous product. And the getaway plan was perhaps the most cynical part of all. A legal strategy that drained the company of its assets and then weaponized the bankruptcy code itself, attempting to launder a fortune and buy permanent legal absolution. The Sackler name is now synonymous with the epidemic. It has been stripped from the walls of museums and universities around the world, a public shaming that costs the family nothing but its reputation, but the architecture of their crime remains. They didn't just break the rules. They demonstrated how the rules themselves could be rewritten by those with enough money to buy the pen. They engineered a crisis, extracted a fortune, and almost used the law as their final getaway car. The ultimate question this case leaves us with is not whether justice was served, but whether, in the face of such calculated, systemic greed, our concept of justice is even equipped to answer the scale of the crime. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.